You know what? There are so many reasons to be excited and optimistic about our future. So many cracks of light in our world right now. People who are out there courageously blazing new trails and leading the way towards a world where people, planet, and profit collectively thrive. I want you to hear their ideas and let them inspire you to see this time we're in as a fascinating time of transformation. Welcome to the Cracks of Light podcast. I am your host, Laura Storm. Throughout this podcast series, we will co-create a leadership manifesto for a thriving world. Please feel free to join us by going to my website, www.laura-storm.com. And now to episode 6 on a new breed of entrepreneurs by the man who coined the term civic enterprise decades ago, Marcello Palazzi. Marcello is a progressive economist, entrepreneur, and leader. He is the founder of Progressio Foundation that is dedicated to help develop the civic economy, an economy focused on citizens' interest as opposed to one serving private or public interest alone. Marcello began his career as a young entrepreneur in his 20s. He has 2 MBAs and degrees from LSE, London Business School, Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. He has always been guided by a desire to transform entrepreneurship to be a force for good and serve as a global ambassador for the B-corp movement. So when talking about how we see the rise of a new breed of entrepreneurs, I couldn't think of a better man than Marcello. In this episode, we talk about the rise of conscious entrepreneurs, the B-corp movement, the systemic challenges we're facing, how to reevaluate profits, the role of the ego, the MEtoo movement, and the rise of feminine leadership. I promise you'll be inspired, motivated, and excited about the future. Let's start. Marcello, you have degrees from some of the world's most prestigious universities and you have 2 MBAs. You could have easily made a very successful and profitable career in the traditional corporate world. Yet you've always been passionate about proving that entrepreneurship can be both sustainable and a force for good in society. Why is that? Why were you not tempted to go the traditional corporate career way?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned. Actually, now that I'm in my 50s, I have joined one of the committees of the board of Danone in the United States, which is a $6.5 billion company. So you could say this is my entry into the real corporate world. But the reason why I haven't is because when I was doing my MBA, my first MBA at LBS, 1985-87, I was the only one in my class who I was already an entrepreneur at the time. And everyone was working for PricewaterhouseCoopers and Barclays Bank and all these blue chip companies. And I had the kind of shivers about thinking of having to wear a gray suit and join all this army of executives in companies in those days. You know, this is like, 85 is 30-something years ago, 30 years ago, 32 years ago. They were very monolithic. They were very bureaucratic. They were very boring companies. And it just wasn't me. So I had already started a company, which I started with my father in environmental technologies. And basically, after my MBA, I continued. So I was always, and only recently in the last, I would say, 5-10 years, when I've seen that bigger companies, what you call mainstream corporates, have woken up. They are generally more entrepreneurial, more open, less bureaucratic. There's more freedom to be yourself in these companies than there ever was. So, yeah, things have changed. 2013, I was a fellow at Harvard for a year. And when I had to apply, I was invited to apply. So I applied and I had to write this 5-page essay about why I should spend a year at Harvard in this very fancy program called Advanced Leadership Initiative, which is a 1-year, 5 schools. You could do what you like, basically. It's like a treasure hunt. And I spent this whole Saturday morning, I was writing this essay, and the essay I entitled it Goodness, Beauty, and Truth in Entrepreneurship. which is actually the trilogy of the Greek philosophy values. So if you go back to Aristotle and Plato, well, they're obviously different, Aristotle and Plato, but the heart of Greek philosophy is this trilogy of goodness, beauty, and truth. So for me, even if I didn't really know it in this way when I was doing my MBA, I was looking for those kind of values, and I certainly didn't find them in the big corporates of 30 years ago.
In the 1980s, you coined the term civic enterprise, and you also founded the Progressio Foundation. What does those terms mean to you, civic enterprise and Progressio?
Well, the quick answer is that, first of all, it is a rather dynamic term. It's also contextual in terms of history and time and countries. So in a way, human progress in Myanmar or Rwanda could be slightly different than in Switzerland or Denmark. But in general, it means a sort of evolution and advancement of who we are as human beings in terms of well-being, in terms of meeting the needs of populations and people as a whole. It's a holistic concept. It's a concept that definitely goes much beyond the way we define economic growth. So it's beyond GDP. It is much more holistic concept. And basically, you could say, if you really want to make it short, it's about well-being. It's about well-being of people, meaning, well-being economically as well as socially, culturally, psychologically, a flourishing society where people thrive as individuals, as people as a whole, not just a few people, but the majority of people.
And what made you go from doing 2 MBAs and already have been quite a successful entrepreneur at a young age and then start the Progressio Foundation for the human well-being?
Well, my father was an engineer, entrepreneur. His father was a lawyer and a judge. So we always either talked about ethics or entrepreneurship. So it was really already there in the DNA. And I felt, even before my MBA, when I was at LSE in London, I studied economics, and I was looking for a much more holistic economics, which didn't really exist at that time. This was like 1981, 82, 83. So I started researching ethics in business and what family businesses like Unilever, like Cadbury, some of the more well-known, or companies you could find information about that were run on ethical principles. And then that was the time the ideological, the new neoliberalism was starting, with Reagan, with Thatcher, and of course, many of us had already lived through, at least we were young, but we lived through the socialist revolution, and we did not appreciate socialism, but we wanted to have an economy that was definitely not the neoliberal economy, an economy that would incorporate these values and ethics into what it did. And so there was a gap, and that gap led me and a friend of mine, Paul Kloppenburg, a Dutch gentleman, to start Progressio Foundation. And we wrote a book about, as economic actors, this is what you pursue. You pursue the well-being of the household. The household meant as a community, as a civic space. So that is really, these are not very new ideas. They're very old ideas that the Greeks already had. And what we did with Progressio was to articulate it in a kind of more modern language. And then basically we continued now for 25 years and doing all kinds of projects and initiatives that promote and further develop this idea of economy and entrepreneurship being civic pursuits, being pursuits that need to add value to the community, to society. And now, of course, it's a global community. It's not a household, as the Greeks understood. It's the whole world. And so the challenge is still there. I mean, we've made progress, but there's still, of course, a long way to go.
Mm. And are you allowed to make money as a civic entrepreneur?
So the outcome has to be a positive outcome financially too. Otherwise, you cannot stay in business, and you do not prove the value of what you're doing. So that's at the technological level. This has nothing to do with who earns the profit. What do you do with the profit? No, it just basically at the engineering level, it's like you write a mathematical equation, and what you put in has to be less than what you get out. So what you get out of this has to be more. So there has to be some sort of profit. That's clear. I mean, you can have discussions about it, but this is clear that at the engineering level, it has to produce more than what you put in. Now, then the real issue, which I think people have been discussing, is first is who earns that profit, and then what do you do with that profit? And also, I would say, how do you earn that profit? Because, of course, you can be dishonest. You can be, I don't know, like many of our countries did in the colonial times. We can go and take over things from countries and steal and call it profit. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, ethical activities that produce a positive value. So the short answer to your question, you have to make profit to survive and to show that you're really delivering a value. But it all depends on how you make the profit. And then it depends on what do you do with that profit and who earns that profit. And these are questions that every enterprise, every society has to address. And we see the differences. Like in the United States, it's quite accepted that people make, in a way, they earn all their profit themselves, the capitalists, the owners, whilst in Sweden and Denmark, it's a more kind of democratic process that you're supposed to share it and pay taxes, etc. So the short answer, you have to make profit, and then it's how and what do you do with it.
Many entrepreneurs are driven by a desire to make it in the traditional sense, that you make great profits and that you become a big successful company. Sure, there has started to be a lot more interest in becoming a conscious enterprise where you also focus on being a force for good in the world. But I think many entrepreneurs are maybe steering away from civic or conscious enterprise because they want to make money, they want to make a profit, and they think that those two terms are mutually exclusive. What's your thoughts around that?
Well, so maybe I can refer now to this movement that I've helped to start,
Yes.
the B-corps. So the B-corps, the B originally stands for benefit. The whole idea is these are companies that benefit society, create a positive impact. We now have 2,358 companies in 64 countries, from big ones like Danone, some parts of Unilever, all the way to Patagonia, Ben & Jerry, the more kind of radical companies. Now, we say clearly that we don't expect every company in the world to become a B Corp. Becoming a B Corp means consciously pursuing and measuring positive impact. So it's a stakeholder concept, not shareholders. So you're balancing interest, you're balancing objectives. So what we say in the B Corp is my answer to you, that it's about balancing. It's about creating a sort of harmony, as the Chinese would say, between what you do for customers first, because businesses exist to serve customers, the kind of products, services you sell, you supply, they have to have positive value. And then to your investors, to your employees, blah, blah, blah. And in this balancing, profit is also one of the elements you balance. So I would not be supporting which is not just in business, it's a bit the whole of our society now. Even in politics, people have reduced, it's kind of reductionistic thinking. The same thing, in politics, everything, the only thing that counts is to get elected. And in business, the only thing that counts is profit. That's wrong. I think the right approach, again, going back to the Greeks, is there has to be a balance. You have to balance this interest. So profit is fine, but not too much profit at the expense of other things. So it's fine to be wealthy and to, aim at, well, I wouldn't say enriching yourself, but aiming at being prosperous. But even there are limits. So obviously, like it happens in the US now, in many companies, a CEO makes $500 million and people get sacked and the wages have not been rising over 10 years, and etc. So we are out of balance. So we have to actually strive for this kind of balance in our companies. So it's, of course, not okay to basically take money away from the planet the way we've been doing in terms of nature and the environment. We've been sucking all those resources from the planet and we haven't been putting them back. So, as you know, there was a survey made a few months ago by True Cost, and true costs, look at many industries. And if we internalize all the environmental cost and social cost, many of these industries didn't make any profit in the last 10 years. So profit also is a contentious notion in terms of accounting. What do you put in? What do you put out? So if you're, excuse the word, but you're just screwing the planet or killing people, well, you can make profit, but what kind of profit is it?
Yeah, exactly.
So this is what we do in the B Corp. We try to create standards and measures that allow companies to be more methodical about it. It's a bit like, I make the analogy sometimes. It's been like, imagine you go to the doctor and the only thing the doctor tells you is your blood pressure, which is basically like profit. But of course, being healthy is much more than just having a right blood pressure. And this is what we do. We basically, with the B Corp, we have this diagnostic tool. It's like we do a proper diagnosis of the patient, the company, and then we give them a full spectrum, analysis of the areas where improvement is necessary.
One of the things that I think is the root cause of why many business leaders think of profits only is because that's what we're taught in business schools. I think things are starting to change there as well, thankfully. But even 10, 15 years when I was at business school, we were taught about maximization resources. How could you maximize your human resources and your natural resources? And we were taught about one bottom line only. So that's how many current business leaders are brought up. That's the paradigm that they have been taught in business school. Do you think things are changing at a school level as well? Or what do you see out there? Because you have quite a big exposure to many of the prestigious business schools out there, and you come in contact with many entrepreneurs that are coming out of the business schools. Are things starting to change?
Yeah, some things are starting to change, definitely. But I think there is a wider issue here at stake. Of course, not every business person goes to business school, and some business people, in a way, this is about the cultural. It's the culture of our times, and cultures change over time. They don't stay the same forever. So you've seen it in Denmark and Sweden. These countries used to be socialist countries 30 years ago, and now they become quite entrepreneurial countries. So things can change pretty quickly. So I think what's happening is that one level, it's a challenge we face as societies. So societies become too sort of utilitarian. We pursue single objectives like profit, or if you're a politician, votes to get elected. So we become narrow societies. We become a superficial society. So there is some work to be done to go back or to go forward to a more holistic view of what success means. In terms of the business schools, some schools have changed. Even Harvard now has most of the students, or the majority of students, attend programs around social entrepreneurship and ethical business, etc. I spent also a year at Stanford, 2015. And Stanford is interesting because it's, on the one hand, you have a lot of progressive students and professors. And on the other, you have Silicon Valley, where still making money is the number one thing. This whole business of unicorns and billion-dollar plus companies. So the tension is still there, places like Stanford. I think of all the issues that we have seen, I think the environmental and the governance issue are the most, felt. The governance, because people realize that they don't want to have, scandals like the CEO of Uber or Volkswagen. These things are no good for any company because they wipe out your share value and they create a negative reputation. So governance is being more looked at. What kind of leaders are governing these companies? And the environmental dimension is become quite clear for a lot of people now, that climate change and resource scarcity and the so-called planetary boundaries, they are real. You cannot escape them. I am more concerned on the social side. The social side is we're still far away from having more equitable wages, and these questions are now, of course, discrimination and harassment in the workplace. So the social side is still pretty weak. And it's also weak in terms of the curriculum in most business schools. I think that movements like B Corps can make a difference. Now, we actually have a whole academy called the B Academy, which was started by mostly the B Corps in South America, with over 300 professors that are teaching about what B Corps are doing. And having examples like Unilever and Danone is very helpful. So we can show, and this is in a way the big story of the B Corps is that I would say if 2,358 companies can be B Corps and be successful and be profitable and also balance the interest of all the stakeholders, anyone can. Ben and Jerry making ice cream, which is per se not a particularly, say, enlightened product, it's just nice to eat. They are able to balance all this interest. And we have mining companies and we have mobile companies, mobile telephones. So if these companies have succeeded, anyone can succeed. So this is the kind of experience we want to share with students in business schools.
You mentioned Silicon Valley and what's very much the predominant driver there, the hunt for profit. But that's not the only place in the world that is the predominant paradigm in many ways. What do you think, from decades of experience of working with business leaders, how can we change that around? How can we make them interested in and realize that there's much more to running a successful business than being focused on profit?
Well, if you look, for example, I've been watching for some time, I was always a fan of when Google and then Google, Amazon, Apple before Google, Amazon, and then Facebook. And when they were in the early years, they were all pretty, say, I would call them even noble company. Google do no evil, and Facebook wanted to be just a social network. So what happened is that there's like the seductive power of success. They became more successful than they ever thought they would be. I mean, all these people, even at Apple, nobody dreamt that Apple would become the biggest company in the world. I mean, just no way. So it happened. It happened. So it's a result of a lot of things, but it happened. So people in those positions are now definitely being seduced by the power and the status and the money that they have been able to generate. You have to be nearly superhuman to be able to, say no and not be seduced by that. So there is an element of that happening. Meaning, this is also the power of entrepreneurship, that when you set up as an entrepreneur, you don't really know what the limit is. You don't know how far you will go. You can go very, very far. Like Apple. I mean, Apple was nothing, Apple, 25, 30 years ago, I bought the first Apple computer. It was like a little company trying to compete with IBM. And now it's the biggest company in the world. They put their creativity, their name, their risk. They are kind of, the direct agents behind what these companies do. And these investors, bankers, they never are. They're always basically a bit like parasitic to the system. Society as a whole has to control what the financial system does. It's just such a natural thing to say. You don't want finance to become the master of society. And this is what we have done. We have allowed our banks and investors, the financial system, to become a master of society. That's never going to work. Because again, it's a principle of interest, of balancing interest. It has to be in the interest of the whole, of society as a whole. So the issue is systemic. It's not the issue about the individual entrepreneurs.
What makes you the most excited about the world right now?
I think that there are more and more women entrepreneurs. Also within the B Corp community, lots of women are interested in this because the women are generally more holistic. I'm excited about youth, younger people all over the world. Even just last 2 or 3 weeks, I was in Brazil, in China, in Turkey, and of course Europe, United States. Amazing young people. I mean, we are very educated. People if you look historically, we've never been so well educated. We've never had the luxury of spending so much time thinking and studying. So something good is coming out of this. It's amazing, knowledge and intelligence we have. So that gives me a lot of hope, and we need to channel it in the right way. And that is what, people like, groups like B Corps are doing, and many others.
Are you seeing more and more conscious enterprises popping up these days?
Yeah, definitely. There's no question about it. First of all, I'm using this the other day I developed this kind of 7 Ps, but there's nothing more powerful than purpose combined with passion, generating profit, serving people and planet. I mean to say that what I really mean to say is that there's nothing more powerful than purpose and passion that can generate profit if you succeed to do that. Because that is, in a way, I think that if there is a God, God gave us a planet and gave us entrepreneurship. That is the capacity of people to organize themselves and create things. And that is amazing.
So in my quest to understand what is really the root cause of the current problems that we see in our world right now, broken ecosystems and people who are stressed and burned out and financial crisis, etc. What I have come across again and again is that the role of the ego and ego in overdrive is the main cause and the main ill in our world right now. What's your thoughts and reflections around that?
The ego, definitely. So in one of the projects that I've done, 1999, 2005, is to create this small foundation called Spirit in Business, together with the Dalai Lama and leaders from different faiths and business leaders. And we tackled this question. This was a very big issue about this ego. I think that the answer is that everyone has to work on their own, say, personal development, personal enlightenment. It doesn't mean that we all become enlightened, but at least we have a journey of enlightenment. And this is hard work. Even the Dalai Lama himself, he still meditates 3 or 4 hours a day. So it is hard work. So we're not doing that, and our educational system doesn't do that either. In fact, we did design a program at the University of Rotterdam with the Dalai Lama called Education of the Heart, which is about actually how do you start exposing kids and young people to this personal spiritual journey, which our systems don't do. So we need to do that. It's just like cultivating anything else in life. You have to do it. You have to practice it.
But I think to many business leaders, putting your ego in the backseat is counterintuitive. It feels like letting go of prestige and power and position. What's your thoughts around that? Is that really letting go of that?
No, it's not true. It's not true. This is just a very simplistic view of what being a leader means. A lot of successful leaders, or, well, maybe not a lot, but there are leaders out there who understand that their power is intimately linked to the powers of others. So it's basically about co-creating the future with the people you're working with, whether it is as a political leader or as a business leader. I think that being ego-driven is just the very, perhaps, primitive way of being a leader. At the end of the day, even in this book by Jim Collins, Level 5 Leaders, being a Level 5 leader is hard. And the educational system that we go through does not really prepare us for that. Often parents do not prepare us for that. So it's challenging, but it is the way to go. We should be doing more. We should prepare.
What should we be doing? For people who are listening, what should they be doing more of? And what are the benefits of doing that?
Well, I think it starts early. I think that they should be starting this at school. Schools should all be about collaborative leadership and also collaborative entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is meaning identifying, finding out what each pupil or young person, what their passion and capacities are, and then helping them to nurture those capacities, but in a way that is collaborative with others and not just in a kind of the more traditional way, is a competitive way. Be better than someone else and you will be number one and all these things. So we need to start really basically reinvent our education.
And for business leaders who are listening in on this, where education early on is too late, what can they do now?
For them, for business leaders, there are lots of examples now from Nelson Mandela and even in the US, Oprah Winfrey. There are all kinds of people who talk about a more way of being a person and being a leader. So even in the last 10, 15 years, the inspiration that is available is from everywhere. You just have to want it. You have to be open up to a different way of being a leader. And ultimately, it's about, I mean, look at what's happening now with this sexual harassment. All these, well, unfortunately, mostly men or all men, all these men who were, supposed to be, the kind of cool CEOs of their companies, they are now like reduced to nothing. They've all lost their reputation. So this is of course, not the same thing, but a person who behaves in that way of, disrespecting women is often the same person who is disrespecting people in general and not acting out of collaboration or respect or generous intention towards others. And these are the same traits of, I would say, a primitive leader rather than a more enlightened leader. So this is an opportunity. If you're just in the United States now, what's all that is happening around you is for people who look into themselves and say, I want to be different and be a different kind of leader. And it's about their reputation, their names, about the trust that they solicit among others. Seems to be pretty essential. That life isn't only about what you achieve externally, and it's about also your inner peace. It's your own inner journey, the legacy you leave behind, and the wisdom that comes from the ages, the wisdom that was there, hundreds or thousands of years ago. You can read it in, old books and new books, looking for that wisdom. Because ultimately, if we live a life that could be successful but not a wise life, then you're missing out.
What you're missing out on?
You're missing out on the journey that a person can make towards greater wisdom. Because greater wisdom, I would say, would show that it's much more about being relevant, being meaningful than being successful. So this whole notion of success is actually challenged by the more profound wisdom that we have. Therefore, in a way, we are not a wise society. In general, we are an immature society. We're still behaving like young schoolboys. Who has the most toys, for example, and who can you speak with the loudest voice or be strongest, and that is very primitive. So that's what I would say.
So, Marcello, I'm asking all my guests on the Cracks of Light podcast what they think are the key elements to a leadership paradigm that is creating a thriving world. So we are co-creating a leadership manifesto for a world where both people, planet, and profit collectively thrive. What do you think should be in such a manifesto?
So I think I go back to my trilogy of goodness, beauty, and truth. So if we pursue these three, goodness, beauty, and truth at the same time, we go a very long way, if not the whole way, to achieving what your question implies. What does it mean to be a truthful company? What does it mean to be a good company in terms of pursuing what I say a B-corp aims to be a good company, to pursue the interest of all the stakeholders. And beauty, is very wide, but someone like Steve Jobs would say that every product that Apple makes is a beautiful product, that they didn't want anything less than beautiful. But it also goes all the way to ethics. Ethics is very connected to beauty. So I think that this, just digging a little bit into goodness, beauty, and truth is very valuable. Challenge ourselves to be the kind of leaders we want.
Yeah, and I think what you raised there is also incredibly important for leaders to be true to themselves and know who they are, instead of just being rushed into a paradigm of success that they may not really believe in, but they are just so focused on getting ahead of the game that they slowly start to forget who they really are and what's true to them. I've talked to many business leaders in their 50s who have started to feel kind of a sense of being empty inside because they have dedicated an entire life and working career to something that was really not corresponding or aligned with who they truly are inside, but they had never really prioritized the time to find out what's really important to them and what's true to them.
I agree.
Any final reflections from you, or any last kind of crack of light that we can offer the guests?
I do believe that this shift towards a more feminine kind of leadership is really important, both encouraging and promoting more women in leadership position, but also there's more feminine element in the work of men.
What is feminine elements that men could integrate?
It's much more about nurturing instead of conquering, and being supportive, and a bit more holistic thinking. And generally, I think also, there was a very fantastic book by a German psychoanalyst. His name is Erich Fromm. So Erich Fromm wrote a classic book, which is in German is Haben und Sein, it is to have or to be. And that is very key, that we created a society where having is the number one thing, priority. And being is less important than having. And I think somehow, and maybe I'm generalizing here, somehow I think that men are more on the having and women are more on the being. And developing that kind of feminine element also in men seems pretty important.
Thank you so much, Marcello.
Laura, pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cracks of Light podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please help me make the Cracks of Light bigger and brighter in this world by sharing this with your network. Together, we can build a world where people, planet, and profit collectively thrive. And if you have input to the Cracks of Light Leadership Manifesto, please go to my website, www.laura-storm.com. I would love to hear from you. Take care.